Take that badge off. You do not deserve to wear my family's name. Richard Whitmore's voice cracked across the grand ballroom so sharply that every conversation died in an instant. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across polished marble, while a string quartet stumbled into silence. More than 100 guests turned to stare. Maya Brooks stood motionless beside a silver serving cart, one hand still wrapped around a porcelain coffee pot that trembled ever so slightly from the weight of the moment. Richard stepped closer, straightening the cuff of his tailored jacket before grabbing the small name tag pinned to Maya's uniform. With one quick pull, he removed it and let it fall onto the marble floor. The tiny piece of metal spun in a slow circle before coming to rest beside her black shoes. A few guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Others smiled behind crystal glasses, eager to watch the humiliation unfold. People like you should never look me in the eye, Richard said coldly. Maya slowly lifted her gaze anyway. She said nothing. Her calm unsettled him far more than fear ever could. The ballroom suddenly felt warmer beneath the bright lights. Somewhere near the orchestra, a violinist quietly lowered his bow. The soft hum of the air conditioning mixed with the faint clink of champagne glasses as nobody dared interrupt the billionaire. Richard had built Whitmore Capital into one of the most powerful investment firms in America. Every executive in the room admired him. Every employee obeyed him. Every newspaper called him untouchable. And tonight, surrounded by politicians, investors, and television cameras, he intended to remind everyone exactly where power belonged. Clean the spill, he ordered without looking away from Maya. A waiter accidentally brushed the serving cart, sending dark coffee across the polished marble. Maya quietly reached for a linen towel. She knelt without protest, wiping away the stain while expensive leather shoes surrounded her from every direction. The reflections of crystal lights shimmered across the wet floor. Someone laughed softly. Another guest whispered, "She should be grateful she even has this job." Maya heard every word. She simply kept cleaning. Yet behind the silence in her eyes, something refused to break. Upstairs, beyond the ballroom, a printer suddenly came alive inside the executive conference room. Sheet after sheet slid onto the output tray with a mechanical rhythm that echoed through the empty hallway. Nobody noticed. Nobody except Maya. She paused for less than a second. Richard caught the movement immediately. "Do not stop working," he snapped. "The executives can wait for their paperwork." Maya lowered her eyes again, but the sound of the printer continued, steady and relentless, almost like a clock counting down. The air felt strangely heavy now. Outside, distant thunder rolled across the dark sky beyond the towering glass windows. Lightning briefly illuminated the skyline before disappearing again. Richard accepted another handshake from a smiling investor, completely unaware that one document had just arrived upstairs, carrying a secret capable of destroying everything he had spent 30 years building. Maya looked toward the silent hallway one last time. She recognized the file code. She had seen those numbers before. Her breathing slowed. The warmth drained from her face. If she was right, someone inside this very mansion had already betrayed Richard Whitmore. She tightened her grip around the damp linen towel, took one cautious step toward the staircase, and froze when a familiar voice echoed behind her. "Where exactly do you think you are going?" The voice belonged to Daniel Mercer, Richard Whitmore's chief of security. His polished shoes stopped inches from Maya's feet, the rubber soles squeaking softly against the marble. "The ballroom needs you," he said. "Now." Maya looked once more toward the dim hallway where the printer had finally fallen silent. The last page was waiting upstairs. She could feel it. Not because she had seen it, but because the file code burned into her memory like an old scar. Earlier that afternoon, while sorting discarded folders outside the executive offices, she had noticed the same sequence printed across a shredded draft marked confidential. One missing page. One altered signature. Something had not made sense. "Did you hear me?" Daniel asked. Maya nodded quietly. "Yes, sir." She turned back toward the ballroom, but every step felt heavier than the last. The orchestra resumed, though the music sounded strained now, each violin note swallowed by nervous whispers. Guests kept watching her as if she had become another decoration in Richard Whitmore's mansion, invisible until someone decided otherwise. Richard stood beneath the towering chandelier accepting congratulations, his confident smile untouched by what had just happened. Camera flashes burst across the room, reflecting from polished silver and crystal glasses. He laughed with the senator while investors gathered around him like planets orbiting a star. Maya lowered her head and continued serving coffee. "Careful," one guest muttered as she passed. "Do not stain a $10,000 suit." Another chuckled. "She probably makes that in a year." Maya did not answer. Her fingers tightened around the silver tray until her knuckles turned pale. Then the sound returned. Not the printer this time. A faint vibration echoed through the marble floor beneath her shoes. Somewhere below the mansion, heavy machinery hummed to life inside the private garage. She frowned almost imperceptibly. Deliveries were never scheduled during Richard's annual gala. Never. Daniel noticed her hesitation again. "Eyes down," he warned. Maya obeyed, but her ears stayed alert. The low mechanical rumble grew louder before suddenly stopping. Silence settled over the estate for 3 long seconds. Then elevator doors chimed from the executive wing. 2 men in expensive suits stepped out carrying identical black briefcases. Neither wore event badges. Neither greeted the guests. They walked straight toward Richard without speaking. Maya felt the hairs rise along her arms. Richard welcomed them with a confident handshake, but one of the men barely smiled. Instead, he slid a sealed envelope across the polished table beside the champagne tower. "This requires your signature tonight," the stranger said calmly. Richard glanced at the document without reading it. "My attorney's already approved everything." Maya's heartbeat quickened. The envelope carried the exact same file number she had seen on the shredded pages. She took one hesitant step forward before stopping herself. Daniel immediately moved into her path. "Do not embarrass yourself again," he whispered. Maya looked beyond him, her eyes fixed on the untouched envelope. Across the ballroom, lightning flashed behind the tall windows, flooding the room with white light for the briefest instant. In that single heartbeat, Maya noticed something everyone else had missed. The signature line already contained Richard Whitmore's digital authorization. His approval had somehow been placed on the document before he had even opened it. Her breath caught. She looked up at Richard just as he reached for the pen. Richard Whitmore's fingers stopped less than an inch above the pen. Maya's voice cut through the ballroom before she realized she had spoken. "Do not sign it." The words were quiet, but they landed harder than thunder. Every crystal glass seemed to stop vibrating. Every whispered conversation vanished. Dozens of heads turned toward the black maid standing beside the serving cart. Richard slowly looked over his shoulder, disbelief settling across his face before hardening into anger. "You again?" he said, his voice dangerously calm. Camera phones rose throughout the ballroom, tiny screens glowing beneath the chandeliers as guests sensed something they would be talking about for years. Maya swallowed once, the warmth from the ballroom lights pressing against her face, but her eyes never left the envelope. "The authorization is already on that document," she said. "You never signed it tonight." A nervous laugh escaped one of the executives. "She thinks she understands corporate law." Another guest smirked. "Maybe she read it while polishing the conference table." Richard picked up the envelope, his expression almost amused. "You expect me to believe my own legal team forged my approval?" Maya did not answer immediately. Instead, she took one careful step closer. Daniel Mercer instantly blocked her path, his polished shoes scraping across the marble. "Stay where you belong," he warned. Maya looked past him toward the envelope. The silver seal reflected the chandelier above, and for a brief second she noticed the ink shimmer differently from the signatures Richard had written all evening. Her pulse quickened. "Look at the timestamp on the authorization," she said quietly. "It was generated before your board meeting even started." Richard's confident smile faded almost imperceptibly. One of the attorneys standing behind him frowned and reached for a tablet. The ballroom suddenly felt too warm. Somewhere outside, another roll of thunder shook the tall windows, followed by the low vibration of engines starting inside the underground garage. Richard extended the envelope toward his attorney. "Humor her," he said with a dismissive wave. "Then have security escort her out." The attorney opened the document. His eyes moved across the first page, then the second. His breathing slowed. He tapped rapidly across the tablet, comparing timestamps. The glow from the screen reflected across his glasses. A drop of sweat slid down his temple. Richard noticed immediately. "Well?" he demanded. The attorney hesitated. "The authorization." His voice caught. "It appears to have been uploaded to the system at 6:38. Richard frowned. "The board meeting started at 7. Silence. Nobody moved. Nobody even reached for another drink. Maya remained perfectly still, her hands folded in front of her uniform, while dozens of strangers stared at her with expressions that had quietly shifted from amusement to uncertainty. Richard forced a short laugh. "Then someone entered it early." "That proves nothing." Before anyone could answer, the ballroom lights flickered. The enormous screens prepared for Richard's keynote presentation suddenly powered on by themselves. Instead of the company logo, a secure document filled every display. Across the top flashed one line in bold red letters: "Internal asset transfer complete." Beneath it, every major holding belonging to Whitmore Capital had been reassigned to an unfamiliar corporation. Gasps rippled through the room. Richard's face strained of color as his phone vibrated nonstop inside his jacket. He pulled it out with trembling fingers. 23 missed calls. 12 emergency alerts. One message from his chief financial officer appeared across the screen. "Richard, everything is gone." Maya closed her eyes for one brief moment because she recognized the corporation's name, and it was the exact name printed on the shredded page she had found that afternoon. Richard Whitmore stared at the glowing screen as if refusing to blink could change what he was seeing. His phone vibrated again. Then again. Then a fourth time. Every vibration echoed through the silence inside his own mind. Around him, the ballroom dissolved into nervous whispers, the soft clicks of phone cameras multiplying like falling rain. Maya Brooks did not move. She watched Richard's face instead. The confidence that had filled the room only minutes earlier was cracking, one expression at a time. "Turn those screens off!" Richard barked. His voice thundered across the ballroom, but nobody obeyed immediately. The technology director hurried toward the control panel, fingers racing across the touchscreen. Nothing happened. The red warning remained fixed across every display. "Internal asset transfer complete." Guests exchanged anxious glances. A television reporter quietly lowered her microphone, then lifted her phone to record instead. Daniel Mercer stepped closer to Maya, lowering his voice until only she could hear. "Did you do this?" Maya looked at him with quiet disbelief. "If I had that kind of power, I would not still be wearing this uniform." Daniel said nothing. For the first time that evening, he looked uncertain. Richard snatched the tablet from his attorney. His eyes darted across page after page, searching for a mistake that refused to exist. His breathing became uneven. Tiny beads of sweat gathered beneath his collar despite the cold air flowing from the ceiling vents. "This is fabricated," he snapped. "Someone is sabotaging my company." Maya spoke before anyone else could. "No, sir." Richard turned sharply toward her. "Do not speak." She held his gaze anyway. "Someone planned this long before tonight." The words settled over the room with unbearable weight. Even the orchestra had stopped playing again. Somewhere beyond the ballroom walls, a deep mechanical rumble rolled through the mansion. It came from the underground garage. Low. Steady. Wrong. Several guests instinctively looked toward the hallway leading downstairs. The vibration lasted only a few seconds before disappearing into silence. Maya's eyes narrowed. She remembered hearing those engines earlier. They had not arrived to deliver guests. They had arrived to collect something. Richard finally noticed her expression. "What?" he demanded. Maya answered slowly, piecing the fragments together inside her mind. The transfer was never the final step. Richard laughed bitterly. You expect everyone here to believe a maid understands $1 billion acquisition better than my executives? Nobody laughed with him this time. His attorney quietly lowered his eyes. The chief financial officer had stopped answering his phone. The investors nearest the stage began backing away one cautious step at a time. Richard noticed the movement immediately. The room no longer looked at him with admiration. It looked at him with fear. Then the ballroom doors burst open. A breathless assistant hurried inside, clutching another tablet with trembling hands. Sir, she whispered, unable to finish. Richard grabbed the device from her. A live security feed filled the screen. The underground garage appeared almost empty except for 3 black trucks slowly pulling away beneath the concrete lights. Their trailers were sealed. Their destination was unknown. Maya stared at the footage. Then her eyes widened. Reflected in the polished steel of the last trailer was a silver emblem she recognized from the shredded document. Her heartbeat stopped for one impossible second. They are not stealing your money, she said quietly. Richard looked up, confused, desperate. Maya swallowed hard as the realization finally locked into place. They are taking the only evidence that can prove who betrayed you. At that exact moment, every light inside the ballroom went dark. The emergency lights exploded to life, washing the ballroom in a cold crimson glow that reflected off polished silver trays and marble columns. A low alarm pulsed through the mansion, steady as a heartbeat. Nobody spoke. The only sounds were shallow breaths, vibrating phones, and the distant growl of engines fading beneath the concrete floor. Richard Whitmore stared into the darkness, his jaw locked so tightly the muscles twitched beneath his skin. Then he turned toward Maya. You knew, he said, barely above a whisper. You knew this was coming. Every face swung toward the black maid. The warmth that had once filled the Gala was gone, replaced by suspicion hanging heavy in the air. Investors lowered their champagne glasses. Reporters edged closer. Dozens of phone cameras captured every second. Maya slowly shook her head. I knew something was wrong. I did not know it had already started. Richard stepped forward until only a few feet separated them. His expensive shoes echoed sharply against the marble. Convenient answer. His voice cracked with frustration. First you interrupt my meeting. Then you predict my collapse. Now you claim you can explain everything. Maya held her ground, but she could feel every eye measuring her, judging her, waiting for her to fail. Daniel Mercer moved beside Richard, uncertain for the first time all evening. Sir, he said quietly, maybe we should hear her out. Richard shot him a look so cold it silenced the room again. You are taking advice from my maid now? Daniel lowered his eyes but said nothing. That silence spoke louder than any argument. Across the ballroom, one investor slowly removed his Whitmore capital lapel pin and slipped it into his pocket. Another quietly walked toward the exit while pretending to answer a phone call. Richard saw both of them. His face hardened, but panic flickered beneath the surface. Another alert buzzed across his phone. Then another. One by one, executives around the room checked their own screens. Their expressions changed almost instantly. Some looked confused. Others looked frightened. One woman covered her mouth with both hands. Maya noticed a shift before Richard did. What happened? He demanded. Nobody answered. Finally his chief attorney looked up from his tablet, his voice almost inaudible. The banks. He swallowed hard. Every operating account has been frozen pending fraud review. The words landed like a hammer. Richard's breathing stopped for one impossible second. That is impossible. It already happened. The attorney turned the screen toward him. The confirmation was unmistakable. Around the ballroom, whispers erupted into open conversations. Cameras flashed without pause. A television producer quietly instructed her crew to keep recording. Richard reached for the nearest chair, not because he intended to sit, but because he suddenly needed something solid beneath his hand. The billionaire who had controlled every room he entered now looked like a man watching the floor disappear beneath him. Maya glanced toward the dark hallway leading underground. The engines were gone. Whatever had left the garage was already miles away. "You are looking the wrong direction," she said softly. Richard looked up sharply. "What did you say?" Maya met his eyes for the first time since the evening began. "Everyone thinks the trucks stole your company." She paused. "They did not." The room fell completely silent again. Even the alarm seemed farther away. Richard's voice was hoarse now. "Then what did they take?" Maya inhaled slowly. Her hands trembled for the first time that night. "Someone inside this room gave them access." The words froze every person where they stood. Executives looked at one another. Investors instinctively stepped apart. No one wanted to stand too close to anyone else anymore. Richard slowly turned in a full circle, scanning the faces of people he had trusted for decades. Fear replaced certainty in every glance. Then, from the second-floor balcony overlooking the ballroom, a single pair of hands began to clap. Slow. Calm. Deliberate. Every head lifted toward the sound as an unfamiliar man stepped out of the shadows with a faint smile and said, "She finally figured it out." The applause echoed through the ballroom long after the stranger lowered his hands. No one moved. The red emergency lights had faded into a pale white glow, leaving the polished marble cold beneath every frozen pair of feet. Richard Whitmore slowly lifted his eyes toward the balcony, his breathing uneven now. The confidence that had once filled his posture had vanished, replaced by something unfamiliar. Doubt. The man resting one hand on the bronze railing smiled as though he had been expected all along. "Who are you?" Richard asked. His voice was lower this time, stripped of the authority that had silenced rooms for decades. The stranger did not answer immediately. He simply looked toward Maya Brooks. "You noticed the missing page," he said. "Faster than your lawyers. Faster than your executives." The words drifted through the ballroom with unsettling calm. Every eye turned back to Maya. She felt the weight of 100 strangers studying her differently now. The mocking smiles were gone. Curiosity had replaced them. Daniel Mercer glanced from Maya to Richard, uncertainty spreading across his face. Even the security team remained perfectly still, waiting instead of acting. Maya lowered her eyes for only a moment. She could still hear the faint ticking of the antique clock above the fireplace. Somewhere beneath the mansion, the last engine finally shut down. The silence that followed felt heavier than the alarms had. Warm air still drifted through the open service corridor leading toward the underground garage. Whatever had been loaded into those trucks had left only minutes ago. Maya inhaled slowly. "You knew they would come tonight," she said, her voice steady. The stranger nodded once. "I knew someone would open the door for them." Richard looked sharply toward his executives. Faces he had trusted for years suddenly seemed unfamiliar. One director loosened his tie. Another quietly slipped his phone into his pocket after deleting something from the screen. No one wanted to meet anyone else's eyes anymore. Richard noticed every small movement. For the first time in his career, he could not tell who was standing beside him and who had already abandoned him. His phone vibrated again. He stared at the display without opening it. The screen reflected across his wedding band as though even the metal had grown cold. Maya watched him carefully. Moments earlier he had looked at her, as though she did not belong in the room. Now he looked at her, as if she might be the only person who understood it. "Tell me what I miss," he said quietly. The ballroom fell completely silent again. Maya looked toward the enormous screens that still displayed the frozen transfer notice. Then she slowly shook her head. "You are asking the wrong question." Richard frowned. "Then what is the right one?" Maya lifted her gaze toward the balcony. "Do not ask who stole your company." She paused. "Ask why they wanted you to watch it happen." The stranger's smile faded for the first time. A flicker of surprise crossed his face before disappearing again. Daniel noticed it too. So did several attorneys standing near the stage. The atmosphere shifted almost imperceptibly. Maya had said something no one else had considered. Richard's breathing slowed. He replayed the evening inside his mind. The public humiliation. The mysterious document. The trucks. The screens. The timing had been too perfect. Too visible. This had never been only about money. It had been staged. Every guest had been invited to witness his downfall. Richard closed his eyes for one brief second. When he opened them again, he was no longer looking at Maya with anger. He was looking at her with trust he had never intended to give. The stranger quietly reached inside his tailored coat. No one knew whether he was about to reveal proof, another lie, or something far more dangerous. Maya's eyes fixed on his hand as the ballroom held its breath. Every eye followed the stranger's hand as it disappeared inside his tailored coat. The ballroom was so quiet that the faint vibration of Richard Whitmore's phone against the marble table sounded impossibly loud. Warm air drifted in from the service hallway, carrying the lingering smell of hot engines and rain-soaked concrete. Maya Brooks did not move. Her breathing remained slow, her hands relaxed at her sides. The stranger finally pulled out a slim black flash drive and held it between two fingers. It caught the chandelier light like a blade. "This," he said calmly, "is the only copy that survived." A ripple of disbelief swept across the room. Richard stared at the device without blinking. "What is on it?" he asked. The stranger looked directly at Maya instead of answering. "You already know." Maya nodded almost imperceptibly. "It contains the original authorization log." The words landed like another shockwave. One attorney stepped forward so quickly his chair tipped backward onto the marble floor. "That log cannot exist," he whispered. Maya finally looked at him. "It exists because someone forgot the backup server." Silence. The attorney's face turned pale. Richard slowly turned toward his entire legal team. None of them spoke. None of them denied it. The stranger tossed the flash drive across the room. It spun once through the cold white light before Daniel Mercer caught it with both hands. Daniel hesitated, then handed it directly to the chief attorney instead of Richard. The attorney inserted it into his tablet. His fingers trembled as encrypted files began loading across the screen. The only sounds were the soft clicks of the keyboard and the quiet recording tones from dozens of raised phones. Then the first document appeared. Timestamps. Access records. Digital signatures. Security footage. Every unauthorized change had been tracked. Every transfer had a name beside it. Gasps echoed through the ballroom as the attorney scrolled faster, his breathing growing shallow. Richard leaned over his shoulder. His eyes widened. One after another, the names belonged not to outside hackers, but to senior executives standing only a few feet away. Men who had toasted his success less than an hour earlier. Women who had served on his board for years. Their expressions collapsed as the evidence filled the screen. One investor quietly stepped away from them. Then another. The invisible circle around the executives grew wider with every passing second. Richard felt the room shifting beneath him. Not physically, but morally. The people he had trusted were backing away from him, while the one person he had humiliated was becoming the only voice everyone wanted to hear. Slowly, almost reluctantly, Richard looked at Maya. His eyes were no longer filled with pride or anger. They carried something far heavier. Regret. "Why?" His voice cracked before he could finish. He swallowed and tried again. "Why did you keep trying to warn me after what I did to you?" Maya met his gaze without triumph. Without bitterness. "Because if I stayed silent," she said softly, "they would have destroyed more than your company." Nobody spoke. Even the reporters lowered their microphones. Richard's shoulders sank as the weight of her words settled over him. The room that had laughed when he tore her name tag away now watched her with quiet respect. The stranger folded his arms and gave Maya a small nod. "You saw what everyone else ignored." Maya looked back toward the glowing tablet. Her expression changed for the first time that night. Concern. "No," she whispered. Daniel heard her immediately. "What is it?" Maya stepped closer to the screen. her eyes fixed on the final page that had just loaded. A single access record appeared beneath all the others. It carried a higher security clearance than Richard himself. Higher than every executive in the company. Maya's heartbeat slowed instead of racing. She recognized the authorization code instantly. Very quietly, she looked up at Richard and said, "The person who started all of this was never standing in this room." No one spoke after Maya's words. The silence spread through the ballroom like winter air, settling over every marble column, every crystal glass, every uneasy heartbeat. The giant screens still glowed faintly, their pale light reflecting across stunned faces that only an hour earlier had laughed at the quiet woman in a housekeeping uniform. Richard Whitmore remained frozen. His fingers loosened around his phone until it slipped onto the polished table with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than the emergency alarms ever had. He looked at Maya as though he were seeing her for the first time. Not as a maid. Not as an employee. As the one person who had never lied to him. The chief attorney slowly lowered the tablet. "She was right," he whispered, almost to himself. "From the beginning." The words drifted through the room, and with them something invisible shifted. Investors who had refused to acknowledge Maya moments earlier now watched her with quiet disbelief. Reporters stopped chasing Richard for comments. Their cameras slowly turned toward Maya instead. Tiny red recording lights blinked one after another in the silence. Daniel Mercer bent down and picked up the small metal name tag Richard had ripped from Maya's uniform. Its polished surface reflected the cold chandelier light. He walked across the ballroom without saying a word and carefully placed it back into Maya's hand. His voice was barely audible. "I should have listened." Maya looked down at the badge resting in her palm. She gently brushed away a faint streak of dust with her thumb before closing her fingers around it. There was no smile. No triumph. Only quiet acceptance. Richard took one hesitant step toward her. Then another. The expensive leather of his shoes echoed across the marble that had once separated their worlds. Every guest watched him in complete silence. He stopped several feet away. His shoulders seemed smaller now, as though the weight of his fortune had disappeared before the money itself ever had. "Miss Brooks." The words caught in his throat. He tried again. "Maya." She raised her eyes to meet his. Richard inhaled slowly, unable to hide the regret written across his face. "I judged you before I ever knew you." His voice cracked. "I humiliated the only person who was trying to save me." No one interrupted. Even the stranger on the balcony remained silent. Maya answered gently. "You believed what was easiest to believe." Richard lowered his head. For a man who had spent his entire life standing above everyone else, the simple act of looking down felt heavier than defeat. Around them, several executives quietly removed their company badges and placed them on nearby tables. Others stepped away without a word, unwilling to stand beside the people exposed moments earlier. The invisible lines of power inside the ballroom had completely reversed. A young server who had watched Maya endure every insult earlier wiped away a tear before straightening her uniform with renewed pride. One elderly investor slowly began to clap. Just once. Then another pair of hands joined. The applause spread carefully through the ballroom, not loud or celebratory, but filled with respect. Maya did not acknowledge it. Her attention remained fixed on Richard, whose eyes had become glassy beneath the cold lights. For the first time in decades, applause in that room was not for wealth, influence, or power. It was for integrity. The stranger quietly descended the staircase from the balcony, his footsteps measured against the polished marble. He stopped beside Maya, studying Richard for a long moment before speaking. "You finally found the one employee your company could never afford to lose." Richard closed his eyes briefly as those words settled over him. When he opened them again, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and slowly removed a single brass key attached to an old leather tag. His hand trembled as he extended it toward Maya. She stared at the worn key without touching it. The stranger's expression changed. For the first time that night, even he looked surprised. Very softly he said, "Richard, If you are giving her that key, then you already know what waits behind that door. Richard Whitmore kept the brass key suspended between them, but Maya Brooks never reached for it. The ballroom had grown so quiet that the gentle hum of the ceiling lights seemed louder than the applause that had filled the room only moments before. Outside, the first pale rays of morning slipped through the towering glass windows, washing away the harsh reflections that had danced across polished marble all night. The emergency alarms had finally stopped. Only the faint vibration of cooling machinery drifted up from the underground garage, where the engines that had carried away Richard's empire were now nothing more than fading echoes. Richard slowly lowered his hand. He looked at the worn key, then at Maya, and for the first time in years, he realized that not everything valuable could be unlocked by wealth. "It belongs to the executive archive," he said quietly. "Only I have ever carried it," Maya answered with calm eyes. "Then you should keep it." Richard looked surprised. "After everything?" She nodded once. "You still have a company to rebuild. Just not the same way." The words settled over him with more weight than any financial loss. Around them, no one interrupted. Investors stood silently beside the tables where untouched champagne had long gone flat. Reporters slowly lowered their cameras. The tiny red recording lights blinked off one by one, as though even they understood the most important moment no longer needed to be captured. Daniel Mercer stepped toward Maya and opened the ballroom doors without being asked. Morning air drifted inside, cool and clean, carrying the scent of rain across the stone entrance. Richard watched as Maya bent down and carefully picked up the linen cloth she had dropped hours earlier while cleaning the spilled coffee everyone else had forgotten. She folded it neatly over her arm with the same quiet care she had shown before the entire night changed. There was no bitterness in her face. No victory. Only peace. Richard suddenly remembered the cruel words he had spoken when he tore away her name tag. The memory landed harder than the collapse of his fortune. "Maya!" She stopped but did not turn immediately. After a long pause, she looked back. Richard's eyes were no longer searching for control. They were searching for forgiveness he knew he had not earned. "I cannot undo what I said." His voice barely carried across the ballroom. "No," Maya replied softly. "But you can decide who you become after it." No one moved. Even the stranger who had exposed the conspiracy simply watched in silence from the edge of the room before quietly walking away without another word. His footsteps disappeared down the corridor until only stillness remained. Richard looked around the ballroom one last time. The executives who had once surrounded him were gone. The applause had faded. The wealth, the certainty, the arrogance that had defined his life had vanished before sunrise. Yet the woman he had treated as invisible had left him with the only thing no one had managed to steal: a chance to become someone different. Maya stepped through the open doors into the cool morning light. The rising sun reflected softly across the small metal name tag resting once again on her uniform. She walked down the long stone pathway without looking back, her footsteps steady, her shoulders relaxed, disappearing beyond the gates as the city slowly awakened. Richard remained standing alone beneath the silent chandeliers, watching until she was no longer there. He reached down, lifted the name plate he had prepared for the evening's keynote speaker, and quietly placed it aside. Then he looked toward the empty doorway where Maya had disappeared, lowered his head with quiet respect, and whispered the only words that still mattered. "Thank you." Outside, the morning breeze carried the last warmth from the cooling engines into the open sky, while the sunlight settled gently on the path Maya had chosen, leaving behind a silence that felt unmistakably like justice.